It's a great pleasure to welcome Alex Antevska, who's going to talk about toxic exposure, academic engagement with pornography. I've known Alex, worked with Alex now for, well, I see from my own slide, since 2009. She completed her master's degree in, 2012, and has been working as a researcher in mental health and has been travelling. Just got back off the plane yesterday from India, Nepal and Bali. So thank you very much, Alex, for coming to speak to us so soon from your trip.
Is this thing on? Good. Thank you, Nicola, for the introduction, and thank you, Anne, for that really engaging, dynamic presentation. What an act to follow. I'll do my best. It's a little bit, as Nicola mentioned, a little bit more of a disclosure into my experience of my research, and I'll give you guys an idea about what went on and my feelings and how that changed throughout my engagement with the topic. So is it true then, do all guys watch porn? This was my opening question in 10 interviews with 21 participants for my master's research into what men find appealing about pornography. As Nicola mentioned, my academic interest in pornography started in 2009 when I decided to do an essay on porn because it looked like the funniest thing on the list. I thought it was a funny, risque sort of thing to do for a sort of young, liberal tomboy woman who didn't really mind causing a bit of a fuss or a bit of a laugh. And as I began to research and have more conversations around pornography, the assumption kept on coming up that all guys watch porn. I wondered why. What was the appeal? I asked around, was it the nakedness? Was it seeing sex that was appealing? Do men need to see naked ladies all the time? Do they like watching sex? Until finally I got a response that sort of struck me, and it was, I just like seeing a slut take a dick. I wondered if this was the same as saying, I like watching the domination of women. I wondered if this was inherently degrading to women. I wondered if all men notice this. What do they find appealing about porn? These were the kinds of questions I wanted to create a dialogue around and start to bring some actual evidence into the mix. I wanted to ask men what was so appealing about pornography, how they justified the existence and the consumption. How did they talk about it? What social and cultural resources did they have at their disposal? What language did they have to critique or justify pornography? What were the common truths and myths about pornography? Was it still the playboys under the bed, and what had changed since the internet, and more so with Wi-Fi and smartphones and just this increased access we have? Was sexism recognised? Was there any in pornography? Was misogyny recognised? According to the anti-pornography literature, there was some nasty stuff out there. According to the pro-pornography debates, this wasn't really seen as serious or a concern. It wasn't a monkey see, monkey do kind of relationship. And also, I was aware that there wasn't much empirical data, even though academics and social commentators had started to write about the topic after speaking to men. So I set out to do small group interviews with men that had some experience in pornography and were willing to talk about it. I employed a sort of semi-structured interview method, and I employed a sort of naive inquirer where I would sit there and go, do all guys watch porn? What is it? Trying not to give too much information away and just see what their language was and what their understanding was. And the idea of having a few of them in the room to sort of minimize my impact as an individual or as a woman or someone that didn't have a lot of experience with pornography. I asked what was normal, what was common, and I tried to generate a little bit of critique around it. So I would pose questions about degradation and sexism, and taking it all the way to extreme examples like sex work and stripping and prostitution as a way to parallel how would you look at a female performer, things around consent, and then parallel that to, is that the same as sex work? Trying to get some kind of critique. So my story begins, as I already mentioned, a curious student researcher taking on a project that I thought would be unique and amusing. At 22 years old, I described myself as a liberal tomboy, neither here nor there when it came to a stance for or against pornography. I was confident and comfortable as one of the guys in the social circles. I don't have a history of abuse or early exposure to pornography, and I don't consider myself a consumer, and I didn't then. Today at 26, I feel like I am a recovering anti-pornography feminist, recovering from the exposure to a whole lot of porn and ideas around pornography, through conversations, through the academic literature and the material itself. This, over the last few years, had a huge impact on my emotions and interactions in society. I feel like I was and am more aware of sexism and almost at times felt silenced as a woman. So the first level of exposure was conversations around pornography. I often would ask my participants around normal or mainstream pornography, and this ties into what Nicola was saying earlier. Our focus wasn't strictly heterosexual, although you described it that way. It was just what's the most common thing out there. And I did this as part of the symposium that you guys saw a photo of. I typed porn into Google, and you had all these sort of mainstream male and female sort of sex acts and sites coming up. Typing in porn for men, you'd get a little bit of that, but it would go more towards gay pornography. And then porn for women was jokes like men vacuuming and doing dishes and things like that. There was a couple of dedicated sites, and I did do it again maybe about a year ago, and I had noticed that it changed from 2009. So we were trying to focus on mainstream, or what mainstream, trying to figure out what that is, what is common, what gets watched. So my participants and peers, of course, thought that I was against pornography from the get-go. So the initial defensiveness I encountered would try and convince me of why pornography was at the very least unproblematic. We talked about shocking pornography, so not the ass to mouth or the deep throat fellatio, that very much went into the normal category, but the shocking, like, dare I say it, 2 girls, 1 cup, and all the other animal horrendous things that are more seen as a joke. So that obviously wasn't a problem because its purpose was for amusement. We talked about violent and otherwise disturbing pornography that wasn't seen as mainstream, some of my participants would say, even though I believe that mainstream pornography is violent and disturbing. Often the TV violence argument would come up, the monkey see, monkey do, we don't do that, just because we see violence on television doesn't mean that we would enact it in real life. This was all around the initial defensiveness, first talking to participants and also my peer group as going into this topic. I would often bounce ideas off male peers and say, if I asked you this question, what kind of thing would you start to talk about? Yeah. So these conversations often led to more exposure to the material for me. I would get told that there's nice porn, there's loving porn, there's amateur porn, there's relationship porn, there's real people having sex. It's not all just the gonzo kind of what we expect porn to be, those short little 5-minute clips that all have the same predictable sequence. So I was like, all right, I'll go find your loving porn. So I went out and tried to find this and found the sequence of events still the same. The woman's pleasure still fake, the focus entirely on her body and the man's rhythmic thrusting. The only difference was she didn't really get slapped or called a bitch. Instead, nothing was said. As I already mentioned, pornography tends to polarize academics into the pro and the anti, and I won't touch on the sex wars amongst feminists in the 80s, but today's writers still follow the same sort of pattern. In reading some of the literature, there was strong opposition against the material and some horrific examples, what I think is horrific, of degradation and sexism and even violence. And other writers that saw the potential of pornography to be liberating for sexuality as almost making it impervious to critique. Often saying that the anti-pornography debates only provide extreme examples, or in mine and Nicola's case, what we thought was extreme is now tiresome. So the ass-to-mouth stuff. Since I sat neither here nor there with pro anti-pornography debates when I started, I'd sort of decided to read this work with a grain of salt while sticking to a pro-choice stance. In particular, many anti-pornography accounts were dismissed by other authors as too emotional, with little grounding in evidence and research. So we hadn't really spoken to men at this stage. There were no fancy graphs and numbers and statistical data to prove that porn was degrading, or that people thought it was degrading or violent. One particular example kind of illustrates my shift from being liberal and very much tolerant of whatever was out there and whatever people were into, to being really able to identify with the frustration that some of these writers expressed. For example, Gail Dines, in a book she's written, talks about the site called Gag Factor. And when I first read it, it just sounded horrendous. And I described this as women gagging on penises, getting their heads thrust into toilets, wearing contraptions around their heads so that they could be forced into sex acts. And the site also had, the performer had kind of like a little card, and it would say like her name, the date, you know, just like a few little things. And one of the things on there was status and date degraded on. And her status would often be like has no status or cum-loving slut. I assume that, reading this in the book, I assume that this would have been taken down, that this was quite a horrendous and extreme example. For some reason, I decided to type the name of the website into my browser, and it came up still in the exact same condition that she had written about it. And from then on, once I'd clicked on this one site, the volume of pop-ups that came up on my computer with this sort of deep throat fellatio kind of violent porn with the woman mascara running across their eyes and heads being thrust into toilets on bright pink backgrounds with flashing words clearly it seemed a lot more mainstream than what I'd envisioned. So tying this example into my reading of the literature, I assumed that writers such as Dines and Robert Jensen, they were often criticised for providing accounts that were too emotional and based on no empirical data. And after seeing this with my own eyes, and also I'd had people saying to me that they enjoyed this kind of stuff, I began to fully identify with how pleading and emotive their accounts were to try and convince their readers as to how horrible this stuff actually is. I began to echo them in my critique of pornography with the hopelessness of knowing that this would not get taken seriously in my academic writing, let alone in conversation with my peers. And how could I even begin to make a change in this sort of context if no one was being able to take this seriously? They wanted facts over empathy. I thought that the academics in particular were quick to dismiss any critique at all based on the idea that pornography could have some kind of liberating potential, that someone somewhere might find this enjoyable and it might expand their sexual repertoire. Very quickly overlooking the material out there that was so disturbing yet so readily available and free and really easy to find. I described it as a sort of overwhelming apathy and a real concern for young people, and that was almost alarming and so frustrating that it was almost paralyzing and depressing for me towards the end of my research. So I described this as a sort of hopelessness towards the end of my research, not only reading into the literature but in the interviews themselves. I was finding it hard to generate more than a just is from these men that I was interviewing, let alone any kind of critical response. They seemed to have trouble engaging with the topic, or maybe they lacked the language, and I felt like I was coming up empty-handed. Maybe they just weren't aware that pornography could pose an issue. So I sort of saw the lack of critical engagement as pornography's built-in defense. I couldn't seem to get my point across that this stuff really was out there, that it was disturbing, degrading, pervasive. And at times I felt almost paralyzed by the defense that pornography was putting up and the sexism that I seemed to be either encountering more of or I'd become more sensitive to. So pornography seemed to occupy the space that was so common and pervasive that I had the assumption that everyone watched pornography, and often I would get yes as an answer to that question and have this reaffirmed. But no one really wanted to talk about it, and people also said that a lot of women were consumers, but it was taboo, it was private, it was something that was done in the privacy of someone's bedroom. So we didn't really talk about it enough to have the chance to be able to critique it. It seemed that it was sort of silenced and shut up, like everyone did it, yet we don't talk about it, therefore there is no chance of being able to critique it. My general feeling of nothing is going to change came from these circular arguments I was having, both with participants and peers. This was illustrated in conversations with bemused acquaintances in social settings who would first ask me if I watched pornography, then if I produced pornography myself. They would then further insist that I had no right to study it if I did not both consume and produce it. To me, this felt like a built-in defense from pornography itself rather than just an individual's ignorance. My own production or consumption would require a huge investment on my part. I would have to be really into porn to do this, and therefore by critiquing porn, I would then be critiquing myself. So I didn't see how I could be into this stuff and still provide a critique. It would be a huge discrepancy within myself. My work was further trivialized by people who often joked that I could officially say I have a degree in porn. And it was something quite ridiculous and bizarre thing to do. Something so taboo and private could be considered even academic. There was never really a chance to defend myself, and there were simple silencing tactics, and they were sort of masqueraded as lighthearted fun. No one believed that I wasn't a consumer, and at any point I felt like a joke could have been made about my work, my data, my critique, or my sensitivity and inquiry into the issues. For example, if someone made a comment about a female performer, so the thing like seeing a slut take a dick, or comments in response to the same question, I had one guy saying, "I like bitches screaming on the end of my dick, and porn reminds me of that happening. So that's why he likes to watch it." So if I took offense to this, or if I voiced my concern over the language, talking about women in this way, I would often get told to relax, that it's a joke, it doesn't mean anything. And this happened so often that it became paralyzing to the point where I had no response. The paralysis almost spread into my social interactions and intensified when the topic was mentioned. I felt silenced, hopeless, and smaller in society, and not really wanting to be a part of it, and also at the same time seeing there's no way around it. So the role of a female researcher in this kind of space and the mindset associated with this role became more obvious after I completed the project. Looking back at the data seemed actually much more disturbing than when I had collected it. There was a constant flow of sexual jokes and puns in the interviews that at times we thought were funny, but looking back now, they're actually quite harsh things for a woman to hear. I laughed along, and when coding the data, I would sort of convince myself that these men didn't really mean to be that harsh, and obviously knowing that they were either students or working their way towards a great life, a great career, and whatever else they would have going on. After a while, I'd kind of lost the ability to laugh it off. And then later, reading some of the quotes out of context and out of this researcher mindset, I was gobsmacked. I couldn't believe that we lived in a society where this was normal, and I was disturbed at my ability to laugh along to things like seeing a slut take a dick, or one guy saying, "I'm going to send her an ice pack or something," when I asked what their concern was about the female performers after, for example, a really rough sexual act. So he kind of said to me, "What am I going to do, send her an ice pack? I can't have a concern because I can't help her." So I sort of felt that was a lot more lighthearted during the process of the interviewing than reading it now. I find it quite disturbing. While carrying out the research, I developed, I guess it was a newfound sensitivity to everyday sexism. Jokes such as women knowing their place in the kitchen, or even being referred to as bitch, which is quite common in social circles, even amongst women. These were now really frustrating conversations for me with what I saw as derogatory, misogynistic themes. They were often unnoticed by others and made me less tolerant of others. The space I had to occupy as an interviewer also became more apparent after the completion of the project, when I noticed my reaction to all these different kinds of speech. I had felt myself not being able to speak because I would get the, "Oh, it's just a joke," or "lighten up," or any kind of critique. Just the the silencing went so far that it wasn't just a critique I wasn't willing to speak up about, it was anything and everything. When debriefing with Nicola, I described this as shutting down socially and finding it really hard to verbally articulate anything. I avoided conversations or situations where I felt myself going back into that sort of hopeless arguing and what I described at the time like a brick wall. At times I saw myself buying into the misogyny when joking around with participants and peers, and also found myself critical of women who buy into this highly sexualized culture and let themselves become degraded. The growing realization of all the misogyny, both internalized and coming from peers and interviewees, was quite traumatic. It came at a time where I was gravitating away from male friendship circles and towards strengthening female connections. Whether I was aware of it or not, there must have been a lot of mental work that went into keeping my identity as a person that was able to sit in the room and have these conversations. And now, not having to do that, I'm probably a bit happier being able to dedicate my mental space to other things. So the silencing I experienced, I felt was a result of layers and layers of interactions with men, both in the interviews and the research process. Slowly, I also began to doubt the legitimacy of my critique, and I gave into arguments that sexism can't possibly exist because we had a former female prime minister, which is what often got brought up in my interviews alongside really sexist and derogatory language. As a woman living in this atmosphere, I experienced countless jokes, as already mentioned, about women belonging in the kitchen, along with guy friends referring to me as bitch rather than using my name. Immediately after, they would turn around and assure me it doesn't mean anything and invite me to join in with their laughter. In these one-sided friendships with men, I felt powerless to speak. I felt scared to express my opinion, to make an opposing joke, or to go against any unfair comments. I would often get silenced with "it's just a joke," that I was supposed to think getting called a bitch was okay, or that my partner had the upper hand in an intellectual argument because he had the penis, despite my stacking number of qualifications. So I simply got quieter, spoke up less, and even stopped expressing myself altogether. Reconstructing my voice took some time. As the veil of the research lifted, I realized how far I'd sunk into the negativity. I initially became quite critical of other women and girls for being stupid and falling into these misogynistic traps. They should know better than to dress provocatively, chase after men, even though they knew they were with someone else, for example. All my life, I'd sort of preferred the company of males in my peer group and having close one-on-one friendships with women. Even after this, I realized I began to draw more and more on my friendships in female circles. I found myself slowly starting to direct my frustration and critique to society and patriarchy rather than groups or individuals. And I also started to live a more internally focused life through sort of yoga and meditation. I tried to live more inside my own feelings and spirit rather than get swayed by the outside world and the injustice I saw around me. Now, 3 years after completing the research, I've worked in mental health, workforce development as a researcher. I've trained to become a yoga teacher and part-time with my academic commitments. However, my relationships and relating to men are still a work in progress, with communication and commanding space at the sort of forefront of the work. The impact of the misogyny I've been exposed to still lingers. The negative beliefs about women I've internalized at times have led to harsh judgments of both myself and other women. I see this as both a result of the research and simply having more awareness and sensitivity of the conditions that all women in this society face and experience. The research and academic interest in pornography is encouraging, with more empirical data and interest in writing starting to spark up. We can use this to have more conversations around pornography and have more of an idea about the trends and how it's being used. And maybe one day can use this to create material that can potentially lead to more sexual possibility that is based on reciprocity and respect amongst individuals rather than what we currently have in porn. And also something to note on that through these conversations, there were men that were able to have critical conversations with me and did express their concern for the existence of pornography, the effect it has on women and young people. as uneasy as this was for them. So I'll end this talk rather abruptly on the ideas of caution and possibility. I think caution, particularly for our young people and the proliferation of technology making pornography a lot easier to access, and caution for the range of material that's out there that is often pushing physical limits and moral boundaries, and the possibility that exists in something so normative. So everyone watches porn. And what I realized that was lacking in porn, and what both Anne and Nicola have touched on, is the lack of mutual genuine pleasure, and the focus on the woman's faked pleasure and the man's simple existence of being part of this. Well, I realized through seeing some of this that my problem went from just being about the misogyny and the sexism to just, there was no feedback. It's predictable. Nothing goes on in porn. It's boring. It's fake. I didn't see how, I couldn't understand why everyone watched it. So maybe if pornography promoted a sort of mutual respect, pleasure, possibility, it would actually have the potential to shape and change sexuality to something a little bit less restrictive. And maybe if we start somewhere around sexuality, we can move this into the rest of society where women do experience a lot more misogyny and sexism than we realize, and men actually have a lot of limited possibilities into how they can relate and engage and speak and critique. However, I'll leave that for someone else to figure out.
Alex, thank you very much for your courage and just what you've shared. I think it's hugely important that we actually hear the voices of those who are doing the research as well, because of the impacts of this kind of work, on all of us. I'm, I guess, particularly impressed just by your willingness to let us see some of the impact of what the exposure to all that material, how that impacted on you, what, if you like, I guess how it impacted on your own subjectivities. And I'm also coming at this from a concern about the fact that I'm about to, as part of a research project in Wellington, have a PhD student look at a lot of pornographic material basically porn over a 40-year period. And while already aware to some extent of the difficulties and having factored in supervision, debriefing, etc., I guess I'm sitting here now with this anxiety about the ethics of such exposure, and anything you could perhaps or would suggest, just what your view would be, just based on your experience, how that could be managed. Because I think it's a hard thing, because the work needs to be done, and the material we need the exposure of it without the harm being done to those having to be witness to it.
I think we went into it with the same sort of thought that my safety was always ensured while interviewing, and I didn't search all that much. This was just the kind of conversations and a couple of things that I actually went out to see. I think it was, I'm not really sure. I think the debriefing's interesting and useful, and I think also having an awareness of how it might impact social interactions and other interactions outside of the research. So rather than just being exposed to the material, but what that means when they then go and relate in relationships, or how they view other people, and then other forms of media. Like we said, all this stuff's tied in. So the magazines, the advertising, sexual interactions, everything, it's all tied into this thing. So it's very hard to separate exposure to pornography from anything else. So for me, it meant a lot of sexism and misogyny, which I then saw everywhere. So So I guess I would say less of a focus around just the stuff that's actually coming up in the material, and more of what that means.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing, and your narrative was really interesting to me, having been in a couple of very male-dominated environments, not as a researcher, one as a documentary maker doing a film about boy races, and working at an aluminium smelter in an entirely male environment. And I think that there are narrative forms of subjective exclusion that you can be subject to in those types of environments, and I just wanted to say that had a lot of resonance for me, and I understand how hard it must have been.
Just a couple of very quick questions about the participants that you interviewed. Just be interested to know the age of them, and then the impact that they may have fed back on the increased access to porn through handheld devices. Did you see any increased, exposure to and access within the last sort of 3 to 4 years?
So the ages we had from 18 to 32, most of them were around, 19, 20. Can you guys hear me? We didn't really talk about what had happened in the last few years. They did sort of talk about publicly seeing people accessing pornography on buses and things like that. What really came out was one person who said he was particularly desensitized, had particular issue in relationships now because of his exposure. He was someone that started actively pursuing porn at 10 years old. So he described it as being very difficult, like you'd have to download a file to the computer, put it on a CD, take the CD out, take the file off the computer, and he was like, you don't do that now. Like, I had to make so much effort, and the exposure at 10 for him is something that he thinks has debilitated him now to have a relationship. And I think his concern was that I made an effort. Kids these days don't have to make an effort. What would happen? But going into it about the technology, I didn't ask very particular questions. I sort of asked whether they were concerned for guys that were younger than them, and there was a general undertone of yes, but no detail. I think that's more research is definitely needed.